Solve the problem. Create order. A little bit of thought often fixes big problems. And notice that opportunity lurks where responsibility has been abdicated.
I'm just trying to work that out. I mean,
Gotcha.
Early in my career, feels a little weird to say it like that, but it is nonetheless true. But early in my career, I worked within an organization that was, apart from the direct acknowledgement of the principal key players, was in a phase of transition. But because the transition was not being necessarily acknowledged, it was not being properly managed. And because it was not being properly managed, the organization was in a decline. I did not realize when I came to be a part of the team that this organization, a church, had already experienced its initial high watermark and that it was now returning to the mean, and it was in the danger of moving into an inverse growth trend or a decline and a slow death. I was too young at the time, 19, and not really experienced enough to understand all of the dynamics that were at play. But I did recognize that there were problems that seemed to go unaddressed and virtually unacknowledged. It is not that those issues were entirely unnoticed. They would often be spoken about in hushed tones among staff and volunteer leaders when they were quietly talking with one another. But they just weren't being dealt with at the upper levels of the management of the organization. And as the cracks widened, frustrations among the leaders were increasing. As a result of a number of important truths and lessons I learned from my father, I began to try to address some of those issues that I was observing. Ron, my father, is a construction expert, and I don't use that word expert lightly. It actually is true. At nearly 74 years old, he's still working, managing billion-dollar construction jobs. I was once speaking with my father about the organization that I oversee, which is in a vastly different industry, and he asked me what our annual budget was, which at the time was about $1 million a year. And when I told my dad that our budget was about $1 million a year, he responded, "Miles, we sometimes spend that in a day." In fact, one Monday afternoon, he and I were talking about a job that he was involved with, which was for a very well-known tech company. And he came in on that Monday morning to find $230 million in change orders for the job that they were building. Those change orders had come in over the weekend. And if you don't know anything about construction, that means that the company that they were building this building for had made $250 million in changes to their original plan over a 48-hour period. And it is my dad's job to help manage those adjustments to the workload. Anyways, I digress. My father is the antithesis of a wordy individual, quite the opposite of Dr. Jordan Peterson, in fact. But his clarifying sentences often bring amazing perspective. In fact, they're so clarifying that I have a pinned note in my notes application on my computer. Pinned meaning that it always stays at the top of my ever-growing list of notes. And the pinned note is entitled Ron-isms. Every time my dad gives me one of these clarifying sentences, I put it in the Ron-isms note. And one of these clarifying axiomatic Ron-isms, and virtually everyone who knows Ron knows this Ron-ism, is if you're paying anything, pay attention. If you've ever read Dr. Peterson's original list of the 42 rules, you know that pay attention is one of his rules as well. But I like my dad's, if you're paying anything, pay attention. It's a bit more sticky. So I came to be a part of the leadership team of the organization that I was speaking about previously, shortly after my 19th birthday. I began as an intern, a non-paid intern at 19 years old, and I felt entirely out of place, especially when I was invited to be a part of the weekly top-level leadership meeting. if ever there was an opportunity for the feeling of what is sometimes termed imposter syndrome, I was feeling that. And I was struck with the sense that I should keep my mouth shut and pay attention. Again, another Ron-ism on my list of Ron-isms is put your head down and do your job. And if you're paying anything, pay attention. So that's exactly what I set out to do. And as an aside, if you're starting out in an organization and hoping to move up in the leadership stack, this is a good way to begin. Put your head down, do your job. If you're paying anything, pay attention. So for nearly a year, I sat through those leadership meetings and I quietly observed the interplay between the principles. And as I did, it became more and more evident that there were a number of things that were being hidden in the fog. In fact, I think I could say that they were knowingly and openly being just overlooked, not taken care of. And one of the other things that became clear to me as I walked through that first year as an intern was that there was a huge difference between responsibility and authority. And that when you are given responsibility for a task, you will ultimately fail if you are also not given the necessary authority to execute that responsibility effectively. More than a few times, I felt as though I was being often unintentionally set up for failure by being given responsibility without the necessary authority. The reality of these things became a challenge for me. I found myself internally trying to figure out how to garner the requisite authority for the tasks over which I was being given responsibility. And it was in and through these things that I learned three very important rules of leadership. One of them happens to be virtually identical to Rule 4 in Dr. Peterson's book, Beyond Order. Rule 4 is notice that opportunity lurks where responsibility has been abdicated. This is a great rule. And intriguingly, one of the younger guys on my leadership team, he's now 27, I believe, he said to me the other day after looking at the book Beyond Order and looking at Rule 4, he said that Rule 4 is basically what I told him about 5 years ago when I invited him to be a part of our leadership team. Peterson's Rule 4 is effectively identical to the first of my three important rules for leadership, even if it's slightly varied in the wording. There is an opportunity where responsibility has been surrendered. And that's all well and good. In other words, I believe that that is true. There are opportunities where others have dropped the ball. But how do you pick up the fumble? That's where Rule 2 and 3 from my rules of leadership come in. And this is necessarily important if you are going to end up a man or a woman that has earned a position of authority. So in my rules of leadership, and I've taught these in a number of leadership classes that I teach on church planting and organizational leadership. The first one is very similar to Dr. Peterson's. There is opportunity where responsibility has been surrendered. But again, how do you pick up the slack? Well, that's where Rule 2 comes in. Responsibility flows to those that show up. And third, authority falls to those that take responsibility. This has been my experience of organizational leadership over the last 2 decades. I have watched a lot of people, most of them guys, over the last 2 decades who show up with a desire to be in authority. They want to be a leader. They want to be in charge. A couple of dozen times I've had individuals come up to me after I have preached a message or I've taught a class and they say, I want to do what you do. It isn't entirely clear what it is that I do that they want to do, other than they think they want to be in a lead position, an in-charge position, which is not a bad thing. It's a good desire to want to be a leader and to be in a position of authority. So there is a sense in which when I meet someone who wants to be in a leadership position, I kind of want to fan that initial spark into a flame. The Apostle Paul, he said something very similar to this in one of his letters to a young up-and-coming leader. He says, if a man desires the position of an elder or a leader, he desires a good work. That's not a bad thing. So I have met dozens of individuals that have desired to lead, but nearly all of them, I would go so far as to say probably 999 out of 1,000 of them end up falling by the wayside. They want to be one in authority, but they're unwilling to show up and take responsibility. The very few that will, they end up as leaders. In fact, the leader that I mentioned a few minutes ago, he is the youngest leader on our leadership team. And at about 27 years old, he's in a key leadership position. And in more than 20 years of organizational leadership, he is one of less than probably 5 young men who took up my challenge to show up. It is wholly true that opportunity lurks where responsibility has been abdicated, but that doesn't in any way mean that you will end up leading or in a position of authority. It just means that there is an opportunity, and the opportunity will remain nothing more than an opportunity until someone shows up to take responsibility for it. At 19 years old, I showed up and began to take responsibility for the issues that were being consciously or maybe even unconsciously overlooked. And 9 years later, when I was 28, I was asked to lead the organization as the senior pastor of that same church. At the opening of the 4th chapter of Dr. Peterson's book, Beyond Order, he writes, "If you want to become invaluable in a workplace, in any community, just do the useful things that no one else is doing. Arrive earlier and leave later than your compatriots. Organize what you can see is dangerously disorganized. Work when you are working instead of looking like you are working. And finally, learn more about the business or your competitors than you already know. Doing so will make you invaluable, a veritable linchpin." The New Testament contains a book which is most often simply referred to as Acts. In most Bibles, though, it is actually entitled The Acts of the Apostles. What is interesting is that the actual individuals that were called apostles by Jesus are not the dominant center stage players of the book called The Acts of the Apostles. It is not that they're completely removed from the narrative, but they aren't as central as you might presume that they would be based upon the title of the book. Instead, we read of individuals like Stephen, Philip, Barnabas, Saul, and Silas. They were not among the original called ones that were set apart as apostles by Jesus. Early in the narrative, this young man named Stephen ascends as an important figure because he took up responsibility for a task that was being neglected. He is eternally enshrined in the pages of Scripture as a key figure of Acts and is identified as the first martyr of the church because opportunity lurks where responsibility has been abdicated. This has proven true in my own life, and I've observed it in the lives of a few others that have shown up and taken responsibility for those things that no one else is taking responsibility for. You may object, I see the problems and I recognize that no one is dealing with them, but I don't know how to deal with them. To this, I'd say, figure it out. Even if it takes you 2 or 3 times as long as someone else who might be an expert in that task. If no one else is doing it, then it isn't getting done. And if you take responsibility for whatever that thing is, you can bet that you will get better at it. And you can bet that you'll make yourself indispensable in the process. Along the way of spending time with Ron, my dad, I've learned some other important Ron-isms. Among them are these 3 simple truths. Solve the problem. Create order. A little bit of thought often fixes big problems. And notice that opportunity lurks where responsibility has been abdicated. And as you show up, take responsibility, and find authority, you'll also discover great meaning. Some important things to consider. We'll see you next time.